I still remember the day we left, the sharp sting of betrayal etched deep into my memory. Though I was only 13, the world suddenly tilting beneath me as my parents packed the car with what they claimed were essential things and left the rest behind, leaving me in a haze of confusion and anger, their parting words almost laughingly cruel. "You'll figure it out," as if those 3 words could explain the emptiness that swallowed me whole. And I remember standing in the driveway, my small backpack clutched to my chest, staring at the receding car that carried my family away, the certainty of abandonment pressing into me like a physical weight. And for years, I lived with that emptiness, moving through schools, homes, and relationships with a hollow space inside that no friend, teacher, or mentor could fill. The silence of their absence echoing in every corner of my life, shaping the way I learned to survive, to trust only myself, to fight for even the smallest victories in a world that seemed determined to remind me I had been left behind. And as the years passed, the anger and the hurt fused into a driving force, compelling me to excel, to achieve, to rise above the shadow of those early losses. Because the only way I could honor myself was to ensure that my life, my accomplishments, and my survival could never be diminished by the people who had abandoned me. And through high school, college, and early adulthood, I carried the fire of that determination, pushing relentlessly toward independence, learning the hard truths of self-reliance. And eventually, 15 years later, I stood fully formed as an adult, successful in ways I had once only imagined, financially stable, emotionally resilient, and capable of facing the world without needing anyone to validate my existence. And yet, even in the midst of my triumphs, there lingered a quiet ache, the residue of that betrayal that had shaped me. Because leaving at 13 without explanation was a wound that refused to fade, a scar that shaped every relationship, every trust, every ambition. And then, without warning, they reached out. 15 years after the fact, their voices tentative on the phone, their messages carefully constructed, claiming remorse, longing, and a desire to reconnect. And I remember feeling a torrent of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, curiosity, and a residual longing for the family I had been denied. Because despite all the years, all the struggles, and all the victories, part of me had never stopped hoping for acknowledgement, for an apology, for recognition of the pain I had carried silently all these years. And as I listened to their words, carefully chosen and rehearsed, I realized that I was no longer the helpless child they had abandoned, no longer the scared 13-year-old left to figure out life alone, but a strong, independent adult who had built a life from the ruins of their absence. And the thought both terrified and exhilarated me, because finally I could decide how, if at all, to allow them back into a life that they had walked away from. And that decision was mine alone, tempered by years of struggle, the relentless pursuit of self-sufficiency, and the understanding that the love, support, and guidance I had lacked as a teenager had forced me to create an unshakable resilience that could never be undone. And as I stared at my phone, reading their carefully worded messages, I felt a mixture of triumph and caution, knowing that while they might seek forgiveness, recognition, or connection, I now possessed the clarity, the experience, and the independence to set the terms, to determine whether their attempt at reconciliation would be allowed to touch the life I had fought so fiercely to build. And in that moment, the memory of being 13, abandoned, and forced into the world without explanation surged with vivid intensity, reminding me of the strength I had gained, the battles I had fought, and the person I had become, a person who no longer needed their presence to validate existence, but who could choose, consciously and deliberately, to let them back into the circle of a life they had once shattered. And as I sat in quiet reflection, the juxtaposition of past abandonment and present empowerment filled me with a clarity I had never known, because the years of struggle, solitude, and achievement had forged a self-reliance that was unshakable, a resolve that could face the potential return of those who had left me with only a promise of figuring it out on my own. And in that awareness, I found both the peace of survival and the power of choice, knowing that whatever path I chose, it would be on my terms, guided by the lessons, the strength, and the resilience that 15 years of independence had given me. And that sense of self-possession, hard-earned and fiercely protected, was a gift I had discovered in the absence of those who had once abandoned me. A gift that no apology, no sudden reconnection, no plea for forgiveness could take away unless I chose to allow it. And in that quiet, potent moment, I understood the profound reality that my life, shaped by abandonment and perseverance, was mine alone to command, and that the past, though it had hurt, no longer dictated the terms of my present or the possibilities of my future. After receiving their tentative messages, I spent hours sitting in quiet reflection, staring at the glow of my phone as though it contained some hidden truth about the years I had lived without them. And in that silence, memories surged with an intensity that both startled and strengthened me. The echoes of being 13, confused, abandoned, and forced into a world I was not prepared for flooding my mind, reminding me of the nights I had cried alone, the school years I had navigated without guidance, the first jobs I had taken to support myself, and the countless moments in which I had relied solely on my own resilience to survive. And yet, Juxtaposed against those painful memories was the life I had built, the achievements I had claimed through determination, grit, and unwavering focus, the relationships I had cultivated with friends and mentors who had become chosen family, the sense of self I had forged that could not be shaken by their sudden appearance after 15 long years. And in that moment, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and cautious hope settled over me, because while I had no obligation to welcome them back, the child I once was, the one left behind, had longed for acknowledgement, for validation, for a simple recognition that being abandoned had left a wound. And now, as an adult, I was in a position to set the terms, to define the boundaries of their re-entry into my life, if I chose to allow it. And the complexity of that decision weighed on me heavily, because I understood that forgiveness would not erase the past, that reconciliation would not heal the scars instantaneously, and that acceptance of their presence would require more than a casual willingness. It would demand that they confront the consequences of their absence, acknowledge the pain caused, and approach the relationship with the humility and respect that had been absent for so many years. And as I drafted my response, carefully weighing each word, tone, and phrasing, I felt the power that came from 15 years of independence, the strength that had been honed through every obstacle and challenge I had faced without them. And I realized that I no longer needed their validation to define my worth, to affirm my accomplishments, or to feel complete, because I had built a life that was fully mine, shaped by resilience, self-reliance, and the fierce determination to survive and thrive in spite of abandonment. And yet, alongside that empowerment, there was an undeniable pull of the past, the echo of the 13-year-old girl who had been left alone, who had once wished for their guidance, their protection, their love. And it was that echo that gave me the ability to respond with both measured compassion and firm boundaries, because I could choose to engage without surrendering control, to acknowledge without excusing, to confront without losing myself. And as I pressed send on my carefully considered message, inviting a conversation that would establish clarity and accountability, I felt a surge of both relief and anticipation, because finally, the years of silence, neglect, and absence could be addressed on my terms, and I could determine whether any semblance of connection could exist, based on honesty, recognition, and respect. And in that moment, I understood the profound truth that the power to define my life, to reclaim my narrative, and to protect my peace had always been within me, forged in the fire of abandonment, honed through the trials of adolescence and adulthood, and now, 15 years later, fully realized. And as I waited for their response, I sat quietly in the calm of my own strength, aware that whatever came next, apology, explanation, regret, or further disappointment, I had already claimed the most important victory, the control, clarity, and self-possession that could never be taken away. And that knowledge, solid and unshakable, became the foundation upon which I would navigate the delicate, complex process of reconciling with the past, confronting absence, and deciding whether to allow those who had left me into the life they had once abandoned, all while standing firmly in the adult strength that had been born of survival, independence, and relentless perseverance. Their reply arrived days later, carefully worded, tentative, each word seemingly weighed to test my reaction. And as I read through the message, a storm of emotions surged through me. Surprise, skepticism, lingering anger, and an almost involuntary yearning for some form of acknowledgement of the years they had taken from me. Because 15 years of absence was not simply a gap in time, it was a void that had shaped every choice, every relationship, every measure of self-worth I had cultivated on my own. And yet now, as adults, they sought entry into a life they had abandoned, and the audacity of it burned within me, even as a part of me, the child I once was, felt the stirrings of hope that perhaps they had truly realized the weight of their actions, that perhaps they had come to understand the consequences of leaving a 13-year-old to navigate the world alone. And as I typed a response, carefully measured to convey both acknowledgement of their attempt and the boundaries I required, I realized how profoundly I had grown, because the ability to respond calmly, firmly, and with clarity was a skill forged in the crucible of abandonment, struggle, and relentless self-reliance. And I reflected on the countless nights spent wondering what it would be like if they had been present, if their support had been steady, if the life I had built could have been shaped in collaboration rather than through necessity alone. And the juxtaposition of that imagined past against the reality I had created now as an independent adult filled me with a mixture of melancholy and pride, because the life I had fought to build, every accomplishment, every milestone, every step toward security and happiness was wholly mine, untainted by their absence. And yet the possibility of reconnecting, even cautiously, stirred something complex within me, a blend of curiosity, residual longing, and the need to assert control over the narrative of my life, because I could no longer be passive, no longer be swept along by the whims of those who had left me behind. And as we arranged to speak, the anticipation was tempered by the recognition that this was not simply a conversation, but a test of boundaries, accountability, and truth. And when the call finally began, their voices tentative, almost hesitant, I felt the weight of the past pressing into the present, because every word, every tone, every pause carried the potential to confirm whether this attempt at reconnection was genuine or simply performative. And I navigated the conversation with deliberate precision, acknowledging their words without relinquishing control, recognizing their remorse without excusing the absence, probing for sincerity while maintaining my composure. And in that delicate balance, I felt the strength I had forged over the years crystallize, because the person on the phone could no longer dictate my feelings, my boundaries, or the terms of engagement. I was fully capable of steering the dialogue, setting expectations, and safeguarding the life I had fought so hard to build. And as they shared fragmented stories of regret, attempts to explain their absence, and the challenges they faced during those years, I listened, absorbing the details while filtering through the lens of years of resilience, understanding that acknowledgement alone was insufficient without accountability, and that my acceptance would be contingent on their recognition of the consequences their departure had wrought. And as the conversation continued, I realized that 15 years of independence had not only strengthened my capacity for self-reliance, but also sharpened my ability to discern motives, intentions, and sincerity, because I had built a life without them, and now that they sought to enter it, I was equipped with clarity, evidence of my own achievements, and the awareness that any reconnection must respect the boundaries I had established, honor the time lost, and acknowledge the struggles endured. And by the end of the conversation, I felt a profound sense of both empowerment and peace, knowing that while the past could not be erased, the present was fully mine, and the future could only be shaped by the choices I made, firmly rooted in the strength, resilience, and independence that had been forged from years of navigating life without their presence. And in that awareness, I understood that the greatest victory was not in forcing forgiveness or reconciliation, but in asserting my autonomy, maintaining my self-respect, and ensuring that any connection moving forward would be measured, intentional, and entirely on my terms. Because finally, I had reclaimed the narrative of my life, no longer defined by absence or abandonment, but by the unwavering strength and determination that 15 years of self-reliance had instilled. And that realization filled me with a quiet, unshakable pride, the knowledge that I had survived, thrived, and was now fully capable of facing the past without losing myself to it, fully capable of determining whether to allow them in or to let the distance remain, a distance I had crossed alone, but one I now controlled entirely. The days following that initial conversation became an intricate, almost obsessive process of reflection, analysis, and careful emotional calibration, because the sudden reappearance of the people who had abandoned me so completely at 13 forced me to confront layers of emotion I had long buried under years of self-reliance, achievement, and survival, and every waking moment seemed imbued with the weight of what had been lost, what had been gained, and what might now be possible. Yet I could not allow myself to be swept away by the tides of nostalgia or the seductive pull of unresolved longing, because 15 years of absence had taught me that trust was not given lightly, that boundaries were essential, and that my own well-being must come before any attempt at reconnection. And so I navigated my days with a careful balance, moving through work, social obligations, and personal routines, while simultaneously cataloging and analyzing every word, every tone, every subtle implication in the messages and calls I had exchanged with them, parsing sincerity from performance, remorse from convenience, and intent from desperation. Because it was not enough for them to say they were sorry. Their understanding of the consequences, the emotional impact of leaving me to fend for myself during formative years, had to be evident, palpable, and undeniable. And as I reflected on the child I had been, the one left with a raw, aching void and only the vaguest instructions to figure it out, I felt a mixture of anger and awe at the resilience I had developed, the independence I had forged, and the unshakable determination that had carried me through school, work, relationships, and moments of profound loneliness. And in this reflection, I understood that the strength I now possessed was born of necessity, tempered by adversity, and fortified by years of self-reliance, so that any attempt by them to enter my life could not manipulate, disorient, or destabilize me. And with that clarity came a profound sense of control, a quiet but resolute knowledge that the narrative of my life was mine to command, shaped not by absence or regret, but by the choices, actions, and resilience I had cultivated over the last decade and a half. And as I prepared for further contact, planning each interaction, considering each word, tone, and response, I felt the weight of accumulated experience settle into a form of strategic patience, the awareness that reconciliation, if it were to occur, could not be rushed, coerced, or guided solely by their wishes, because the past could not be undone, and the child I once was would never again be subject to abandonment or neglect without consequence. And so I moved forward with a careful, deliberate approach, balancing openness with caution, acknowledgement with boundaries, and curiosity with rigorous self-preservation. And as the days stretched into weeks, I began to notice subtle changes, both within myself and in their responses, the tentative expressions of regret in their tone, the slight acknowledgement of the hardships I had faced alone, the hesitancy in their messages that suggested they were beginning to understand, even partially, the depth of the void they had created. And each small sign of comprehension, while not erasing the past, offered a measure of hope that any potential reconnection could be grounded in honesty, recognition, and respect. And yet, alongside this hope, there remained a lingering vigilance, because I had learned that appearances of remorse could be performed, that words could be carefully crafted to elicit forgiveness without true understanding, and that the risk of manipulation, intentional or not, was ever present. And so I continued my meticulous observation, cataloging every word, every pause, every inflection, every hesitation, building a detailed mental and emotional map of their intentions, sincerity, and comprehension, because only through this careful scrutiny could I navigate the treacherous territory of family reconnection without sacrificing the autonomy, peace, and security I had fought so hard to achieve. And as I reflected on the person I had become, the adult who had survived abandonment, achieved independence, and cultivated resilience, I realized that my decisions now were imbued with power, clarity, and agency that the 13-year-old version of myself could never have imagined. And this recognition became both a shield and a compass, guiding my interactions, informing my boundaries, and reinforcing the principle that reconnection, if it were to occur, would be on my terms, within the parameters I set, and with respect for the years of self-sufficiency and personal triumph that had been forged in the absence of those who now sought entry. And as I navigated this delicate, emotionally charged terrain, I experienced a mixture of emotions so intense and complex that they threatened to overwhelm me at times. The anger at past abandonment mingling with cautious hope, the pride in my survival and achievements intertwining with a residual longing for familial connection. And in the midst of this turbulence, I discovered a new level of self-awareness, a clarity born of experience, reflection, and unflinching honesty with myself, because I could no longer allow the past to define my present or dictate my future, and the process of considering their re-entry became not simply a question of forgiveness, but a rigorous examination of authenticity, responsibility, and mutual respect. And in this process, I felt the full weight and power of my own life, the knowledge that my choices were sovereign, that my history was honored, and that the boundaries I established would not be crossed without acknowledgement and accountability. And as the days, conversations, and reflections accumulated, I recognized that the ultimate measure of this experience was not simply in reconnecting with them, but in asserting, protecting, and celebrating the life I had built in their absence, the strength I had cultivated, and the unshakable autonomy that ensured that no matter the outcome, I would emerge whole, empowered, and fully in command of the narrative of my own existence. And in that profound understanding, I finally found a sense of peace, tempered by vigilance, resilience, and the quiet, unwavering certainty that 15 years of independence had given me the ability to navigate this new chapter on my terms, with clarity, purpose, and the knowledge that my life, my choices, and my self-worth would never again be subject to abandonment, neglect, or betrayal without consequence. In the weeks that followed our renewed contact, every interaction became a careful exercise in observation, analysis, and emotional calibration, because after 15 years of absence, their presence in my life, even virtually, through messages, calls, and tentative attempts at connection, was charged with layers of complexity that demanded vigilance and clarity, and I found myself constantly parsing their words, noting tone, hesitation, and subtle implications, cataloging sincerity and possible manipulation, because I had survived abandonment before and had no intention of allowing history to repeat itself. And in those moments of reflection, I became acutely aware of the stark contrast between the child I had been and the adult I had become. The 13-year-old who'd been forced to navigate the world alone, who had endured loneliness, uncertainty, and fear, and the woman I was now, resilient, accomplished, and unshakably independent, whose life, achievements, and sense of self had been forged in the crucible of neglect and self-reliance. And this awareness fueled a mixture of cautious hope, residual longing, and unwavering determination, because while I had built a life that required no validation from them, the human desire for family, acknowledgement, and recognition still lingered beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, and I realized that reconciling these dual realities, my self-sufficiency and the echo of the child left behind, would require careful management, clear boundaries, and deliberate intention, because 15 years of absence could not simply be erased by words of remorse or fleeting expressions of regret. And so I engaged in each interaction with deliberate attention, observing not only what was said, but what was unsaid, what was implied, what was omitted, and how the pattern of their communication reflected both understanding and avoidance, because I had learned that sincerity must be measured not only by words, but by consistency, accountability, and acknowledgement of consequences. And as I continued to navigate this new dynamic, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the life I had built without them, on the resilience that had grown from navigating school, work, relationships, and the myriad challenges of adulthood alone. And the recognition of my own strength became a source of empowerment that underpinned every decision, every response, every boundary I set, because I understood that the ultimate measure of this experience would not be their forgiveness or acknowledgement alone, but my ability to maintain autonomy, clarity, and self-respect, even as I explored the possibility of limited reconnection. And in this reflection, I acknowledged the deep scars of abandonment, the nights spent crying alone, the moments of fear and uncertainty, the milestones I had achieved without their guidance or support, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of that history, not as a burden, but as evidence of my capacity to endure, adapt, and thrive. And in recognizing that capacity, I also recognized the importance of maintaining boundaries that honored the life I had built, the relationships I had cultivated with chosen family, friends, and mentors, and the self-reliance that had become my foundation. Because any reconnection must respect not only my history, but the autonomy I had fought so hard to achieve. And as the days stretched into months, I continued to engage with careful attention, noting incremental changes in their behavior, the subtle acknowledgement of the hardships they had caused, the hesitations in their tone that revealed both regret and uncertainty. And each detail, however small, became a piece of the puzzle that would determine whether this renewed connection could be healthy, constructive, or merely performative. Because I had learned that appearances of remorse could be crafted to manipulate, and I refused to allow myself to be swayed without clear evidence of understanding and accountability. And as I reflected on all of this, I marveled at the transformation that had occurred within me, the evolution from a scared, abandoned child into a strong, independent adult capable of navigating complex emotional terrain with insight, poise, and control. And the realization that I could choose to allow them into my life, or not, on terms entirely of my own making, became a profound affirmation of my own power, resilience, and autonomy. And as I continued to interact, observe, and reflect, I felt a deep sense of clarity emerging, because I understood that true reconciliation, if it were possible, would not erase the past, but would instead acknowledge it fully, honor the struggles endured, and operate within boundaries that protected my well-being and respected the life I had painstakingly built. And in this awareness, I found a sense of quiet triumph, the knowledge that I had survived, thrived, and emerged stronger from the wounds of abandonment, fully equipped to engage, protect, or distance myself as I saw fit. And in that triumph, I recognized the enduring lesson of my life, that power, resilience, and self-possession are forged not in comfort or ease, but in the crucible of challenge, absence, and relentless perseverance. And armed with that understanding, I continued forward, navigating the tentative reconnection with both caution and courage, clarity and compassion, fully aware that the life I had built was mine, fully intact, and beyond the reach of those who had once walked away. And in that awareness, I finally felt the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had not only survived abandonment, but had flourished in spite of it, and who would continue to define the terms of their own existence with deliberate, unwavering authority. As the months continued to unfold, every interaction with them became a careful negotiation, a delicate balance between curiosity, self-protection, and the cautious exploration of possibilities. Because after 15 years of absence, I had learned that emotions could easily be manipulated, that words could carry hidden motives, and that any sudden re-entry into my life must be met with both vigilance and clarity. And I approached each message, each phone call, each tentative attempt at engagement with the analytical precision of someone who had spent years observing, adapting, and surviving without guidance or support. And in that process, I became increasingly aware of how deeply the past had shaped me, how every decision I had made, every achievement I had earned, every challenge I had overcome was colored by the absence of the people who now sought connection. And this awareness did not diminish my strength, rather it crystallized it, transforming what could have been resentment or bitterness into a driving force of empowerment. Because I realized that the life I had built, the independence I had claimed, and the resilience I had cultivated were victories that belonged solely to me, and no acknowledgement, apology, or attempt at reconciliation could negate them. And yet the complex interplay of emotions could not be ignored. The lingering ache of lost childhood, the moments of longing that had persisted in quiet corners of my heart, and the persistent curiosity about the reasons, explanations, and circumstances that had led to my abandonment. All of these elements demanded thoughtful attention and deliberate processing, because allowing them to intrude without boundaries could compromise the peace, stability, and clarity I had fought so hard to achieve. And so I continued to observe, catalog, and reflect, noting subtle shifts in tone, the hesitations that betrayed sincerity or uncertainty, the carefully chosen words that revealed either accountability or deflection, and the unspoken elements, the silences, the pauses, the things left unsaid that carried as much meaning as the spoken messages. Because after 15 years of absence, I had learned that the truth was often found in what was avoided rather than what was expressed, and each detail became a thread I could follow to construct a complete understanding of their intentions, their comprehension of the past, and the degree to which any attempt at reconnection could be authentic. And as I engaged in this meticulous observation, I also reflected deeply on the journey that had brought me to this point, the countless nights of self-doubt, the moments of fear and uncertainty, the milestones achieved without guidance, and the resilience forged through necessity. And in that reflection, I felt a profound sense of pride, not arrogance or boastfulness, but a quiet, unshaken unshakable recognition of the person I had become, a person capable of navigating complex emotional landscapes, asserting boundaries, and demanding accountability, all while maintaining compassion, empathy, and the integrity of self. And as the weeks turned into months, I began to notice incremental changes in their behavior, small acknowledgments of the struggles I had endured, tentative recognition of the consequences of their absence, and moments of sincerity that, while not erasing the past, suggested a possibility for measured, respectful engagement. And in observing these shifts, I found myself balancing the residual longing of my childhood with the hard-won independence of adulthood, because I understood that reconnection, if it were to occur, could only be meaningful if it respected the autonomy, achievements, and emotional boundaries that I had cultivated over the years. And that understanding became both a shield and a compass, guiding each interaction, each response, and each decision, ensuring that my life, my peace, and my self-respect would never again be compromised by abandonment, neglect, or performative remorse. And as I navigated this careful dance of observation, engagement, and reflection, I realized that the most powerful aspect of my journey was the clarity I had gained, the awareness that my life was no longer defined by the absence of others, but by the deliberate, intentional choices I made every day, choices that honored my experiences, my resilience, and the strength I had cultivated. And as I reflected on this power, I also recognized that the ultimate measure of my journey was not simply in surviving abandonment, but in thriving despite it, in building a life that could not be dictated by the past, in establishing boundaries that ensured respect and autonomy, and in facing the people who had left me with the confidence, clarity, and authority to determine the terms of any engagement. And as I sat quietly in the evenings, reviewing messages, analyzing interactions, and reflecting on the years I had endured, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of self-possession, the knowledge that I had not only survived, but had flourished, that the scars of abandonment had transformed into markers of resilience, and that the life I had built, rich with achievement, independence, and self-respect, was mine entirely to protect, guide, and nurture. And that realization filled me with both calm and strength, because 15 years of living without them had created not weakness, but an enduring, powerful sense of self, one that could face the past, engage with the present, and navigate the future with clarity, confidence, and the unwavering knowledge that my choices, my boundaries, and my life would never again be subject to the whims of those who had once abandoned me. And that knowledge became the foundation for every interaction, every decision, and every reflection as I continued to define on my own terms the story of my life, my resilience, and the possibilities of connection that could only be pursued with authenticity, respect, and a clear acknowledgement of the consequences of absence. As the months continued to unfold, I found myself navigating an emotional terrain that was at once familiar and utterly foreign, a landscape shaped by the echoes of abandonment and the steady, deliberate construction of a life entirely my own, because 15 years of absence had not only forced me to develop resilience, independence, and self-reliance, but it also left a lingering, quiet ache, a space that no accomplishment, no relationship, no milestone could ever fully fill. And yet, as they persisted in reaching out, their tentative words and carefully constructed messages probing, testing, and seeking reconnection, I recognized that the power now lay entirely in my hands, a truth that was both liberating and terrifying, because I had to balance curiosity and compassion with vigilance, reflection, and unshakable boundaries, and every interaction became a study in behavior, motive, and sincerity, a careful cataloging of word choice, tone, hesitation, and the subtle ways that absence had shaped their understanding, or misunderstanding, of the life I had led in their absence. And I observed them with the precision of someone who had spent years surviving in silence, forging a life without guidance, support, or validation, noting each fragment of recognition, each admission of regret, each hesitation that betrayed either genuine remorse or a rehearsed performance, because after years of building self-possession, I could not afford to be misled, manipulated, or emotionally destabilized by someone who had once walked away without explanation. And as I reflected on the stark contrast between the child I had been and the adult I had become, I felt a profound sense of both pride and wariness, because the 13-year-old left to figure it out had transformed into someone capable of steering interactions, setting terms, and demanding accountability, someone who understood that reconciliation or reconnection would not erase the past, but could, if approached with integrity, respect, and honesty, create a new dynamic, carefully constructed around the principles of acknowledgement, validation, and measured boundaries. And in that realization, I found a strange, empowering serenity, a clarity that allowed me to engage without surrendering control, to listen without compromising my well-being, and to respond without succumbing to either old pain or new manipulation. And as weeks turned into months, I observed subtle shifts, small acknowledgments, tentative recognitions of the suffering caused by their absence, the ways in which they now seemed to grasp the consequences of leaving a child to navigate adolescence alone. And each subtle change became both evidence and instruction, guiding the way I could consider rebuilding a connection, however tentative. And yet, amid all of this careful observation, I also reflected on the life I had built entirely without them. The stability, the achievements, the independence, the relationships I had nurtured with chosen family, friends, and mentors, the career I had forged, the home I had created, and the deep sense of self that had grown in the absence of parental guidance. And I realized that this life was mine, sacred and inviolable, and any reconnection could only occur in a way that respected it fully, with no compromises that would diminish the autonomy I had fought so fiercely to claim. And in this reflection, I also acknowledged the paradox of my situation, that the very people who had once caused profound pain were now seeking entry into a life that had been shaped entirely by the necessity of their absence. And I marveled at the resilience, tenacity, and intelligence that had allowed me to survive, adapt, and thrive despite such disruption, because every choice, every decision, every moment of perseverance had built an unshakable foundation, one that allowed me to approach these renewed connections not as a victim, but as a sovereign participant, fully aware of my own power, agency, and right to dictate the terms of engagement. And as I reflected on this, I realized that the strength I possessed was not simply reactive, born of pain, but proactive, a deliberate cultivation of self-reliance, clarity, and the ability to navigate complex emotional landscapes with poise, discernment, and insight. And in that moment, I understood that any reconnection would be measured, intentional, and grounded in a recognition of the past, because words alone could never undo 15 years of absence, and actions, consistency, and accountability would be the only measures of authenticity. And as I continued to process, observe, and engage, I felt the full weight of my own journey settle into an unshakable equilibrium, a quiet triumph that blended awareness, resilience, and authority, because I was no longer a child abandoned, no longer a person defined by absence, no longer vulnerable to manipulation or coercion, but an adult fully in command of her life, choices, and boundaries. And as the interactions progressed, I began to sense the subtle shifts not only in them, but in myself, the deepening awareness of how far I had come, the recognition of the strength I had cultivated, the quiet joy of knowing that survival had become mastery, that independence had become empowerment, that the wounds of the past had been transformed into markers of resilience, and that the life I now led was fortified against the very forces that had once threatened it. And in that knowledge, I felt the gravity and the freedom of choice, the ability to decide whether to allow them into my world or maintain the distance that had preserved my peace. And as I sat quietly in reflection, I realized that 15 years of self-reliance, achievement, and perseverance had given me not only the power to survive abandonment, but the wisdom to navigate reconnection with authority, clarity, and unshakable self-respect. And in that realization, I understood that the story of my life was no longer written by those who left me behind, but by the deliberate, conscious choices I made every day, in every interaction, and in every boundary I set. And that knowledge, rich, complete, and wholly my own, became the foundation of every decision, every reflection, and every measured engagement, guiding me toward the future I had earned, fully empowered, fully independent, and unshakably in control of the life I had built. The days and weeks that followed their persistent attempts at reconnecting became a labyrinth of thought, reflection, and meticulous emotional navigation, because after 15 years of absence, the complexity of their presence demanded not only vigilance, but a profound understanding of the power dynamics at play. And I approached every interaction, every word, every message with the kind of careful attention that had been honed over years of solitude, resilience, and self-reliance, because the child I had been, abandoned and left to figure it out, had grown into an adult who understood that survival was only the beginning, and thriving required not only independence, but the ability to wield it with intelligence, precision, and unwavering clarity. And so I observed them as I had always observed life itself, with patience, scrutiny, and unflinching honesty, noting the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses that betrayed hesitation, the carefully chosen words meant to demonstrate remorse, the inconsistencies that hinted at deeper truths or omissions. And every fragment of communication became a puzzle piece in a larger, intricate mosaic that revealed not only their intentions, but also the degree to which they truly understood the impact of their absence. And as I cataloged each interaction, I also reflected on the life I had built entirely in their absence, the milestones reached, the independence claimed, the challenges overcome, the relationships nurtured with chosen family and friends, the career forged, the home created, the sense of self solidified through trials that had demanded resourcefulness, patience, and an unrelenting commitment to survive and thrive. And I recognized that all of these accomplishments were not simply victories over circumstance, but symbols of the unshakable strength that had been cultivated precisely because of the void they had left. And in that recognition, I found both empowerment and a new lens through which to view their attempts at reconnection, because while I felt the residual ache of the child I had once been, I also felt the absolute authority of the adult I had become, someone who could observe without bias, judge without anger clouding clarity, and engage without fear of compromise. And as the conversations unfolded, I noticed the incremental shifts in their approach, the subtle acknowledgement of hardship caused, the hesitant admission of regret, the careful phrasing that suggested recognition of consequences, and the tentative attempts to bridge a gap that had long seemed unbridgeable. relatable. And I allowed myself to feel the complex mixture of emotions that these shifts provoked: curiosity, lingering yearning, cautious hope, the flickering memory of the child who had wanted love and acknowledgement, tempered by the fortified resolve of the adult who had survived, endured, and built a complete life without them. And in this mixture, I found the clarity to respond deliberately, with measured words, firm boundaries, and thoughtful observation, ensuring that any potential reconnection would honor not only the past, but also the life I had created, because 15 years of independence had instilled a vigilance that could not be ignored, a wisdom that could see through performative remorse, and a strength that ensured no manipulation or emotional coercion could disturb the equilibrium I had fought so hard to establish. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I became ever more aware of the delicate balance I was maintaining between openness to reconciliation and protection of my own autonomy, the constant internal negotiation of curiosity versus caution, the evaluation of every word and action through the lens of lived experience, and the steady reinforcement of the understanding that while I had the capacity for compassion and engagement, I would never again relinquish control over my own life or surrender the boundaries that preserved my sense of self. And each time I reviewed messages, analyzed interactions, or reflected on the past and present, I felt the weight and significance of my survival, the magnitude of the accomplishments I had achieved in their absence, and the depth of the resilience I had cultivated. And this awareness became both a shield and a guide, allowing me to navigate the emotionally charged terrain of reconnection without compromising my strength, judgment, or peace. And as I continued this process, I also reflected on the ways in which the child I had once been, the one left with nothing but instructions to figure it out, still existed within me, not as a vulnerability to be exploited, but as a source of insight, empathy, and wisdom. Because the experiences of abandonment, struggle, and self-reliance had shaped my understanding of human complexity, suffering, and perseverance. And in that reflection, I recognized that my capacity to engage with them now, to allow for dialogue, to test authenticity, and to determine the viability of reconnection, was rooted in a profound understanding of my own history and strength. And as each conversation progressed, I felt an increasing sense of control, because I was no longer at the mercy of absence or neglect. I was the arbiter of my own experience, the guardian of my boundaries, and the author of my life story. And the knowledge that I could navigate this delicate process without losing myself, without surrendering my autonomy, and without compromising the life I had painstakingly built, filled me with a deep, unshakable pride, a sense of quiet triumph that was not boastful, but affirming, because survival had become mastery, struggle had become wisdom, and absence had become the foundation for resilience and power. And in that awareness, I found a new clarity about the future, that any connection allowed would be intentional, measured, and entirely contingent on acknowledgement, accountability, and respect. And that understanding, forged from years of observation, reflection, and deliberate self-cultivation, ensured that the past, no matter how painful, could be addressed without allowing it to dictate the present, that the echoes of abandonment could be acknowledged without destabilizing the life I had created, and that the adult I had become would never be coerced, manipulated, or diminished by the presence of those who had once walked away. And as I sat quietly in the glow of my own reflection, reviewing months of engagement, considering the full scope of my history and the path I now chose to navigate, I realized with profound clarity that the power I held was absolute, the authority over my life undeniable, and the life I had built, rich, complete, independent, and resilient, was unshakable. And in that realization, I felt the culmination of 15 years of struggle, growth, and self-reliance coalesce into a profound, unassailable certainty. I had survived abandonment, mastered my independence, cultivated resilience, and now, fully empowered, I controlled the terms of any reconnection, fully aware that my choices, boundaries, and autonomy were inviolate, and the story of my life, shaped by adversity but defined by strength, would continue entirely on my terms. As the final chapter of this long and tumultuous journey unfolded, I found myself sitting in quiet reflection, the weight of 15 years of absence, struggle, and self-reliance pressing against me not as a burden, but as a foundation, a solid, unshakable base upon which my life had been built, because every hardship endured, every night spent alone wondering why I had been left, every challenge overcome without guidance or support, had forged a resilience so profound that even now, faced with the tentative and carefully measured attempts of those who had abandoned me to reconnect, I could approach the situation not with fear, not with desperation, but with full awareness of my own power, my autonomy, and the inviolable boundaries I had established over the years. And as their messages and calls continued, I listened, observed, and reflected with meticulous care, dissecting every word, tone, pause, and hesitation to discern sincerity from performance, acknowledgement from superficiality, and genuine remorse from the hollow appearance of regret. Because I had long since learned that appearances could be deceiving, that words alone could never repair years of absence, and that any true reconciliation would require consistent actions, a deep understanding of consequences, and a full acknowledgement of the life I had lived without them. And as I considered this, I also reflected on the vast and intricate life I had created in their absence, the career I had built through tireless work and dedication, the home I had established as a sanctuary of stability and comfort, the relationships I had nurtured with chosen family and friends who had proven themselves reliable, loving, and steadfast, the personal achievements that had become the proof of my independence, and the emotional strength that allowed me to confront life's challenges without leaning on those who had once abandoned me. And I understood with deep clarity that this life, this self-possessed existence, was mine alone, and no apology, no expression of regret, no attempt at reconnection could diminish it unless I chose to allow it. And that choice, for the first time in years, rested fully in my hands, free from coercion, guilt, or manipulation. And as I reflected on the person I had been, the scared, abandoned 13-year-old forced to figure it out, and the adult I had become, capable, resilient, and unshakably independent, I realized that the journey had been less about them and more about me, about the cultivation of strength, insight, and the unassailable knowledge that my life was defined not by their absence or presence, but by the choices I had made, the perseverance I had demonstrated, and the integrity I had maintained. And as the days passed and interactions with them continued, I maintained a deliberate, measured approach, engaging when I saw sincerity, setting boundaries when necessary, acknowledging the past without allowing it to destabilize the present, and carefully evaluating the authenticity of every word and action, because I knew that genuine recognition of the consequences of abandonment could not be rushed, that accountability required time, consistency, and reflection, and that any meaningful reconnection would have to be built on these principles, not on the fragile hope of words alone. And as I processed all of this, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, the knowledge that I could navigate this landscape with both compassion and authority, that I could decide whether to allow entry into my life based on integrity and respect, and that no amount of regret or longing could override the autonomy I had fought so hard to establish. And in that empowerment, I also recognized the enduring presence of the child I had once been, not as a source of weakness, but as a guide, a reminder of the resilience, empathy, and determination that had carried me through years of loneliness, uncertainty, and adversity. And it was that awareness that allowed me to approach the situation with balance, clarity, and purpose, fully aware that I could engage, withdraw, or observe without compromising my peace, my independence, or the life I had painstakingly built. And as the days passed and interactions with them continued, I maintained a deliberate, measured approach, engaging when I saw sincerity, setting boundaries when necessary, acknowledging the past without allowing it to destabilize the present, and carefully evaluating the authenticity of every word and action, because I knew that genuine recognition of the consequences of abandonment could not be rushed, that accountability required time, consistency, and reflection, and that any meaningful reconnection would have to be built on these principles, not on the fragile hope of words alone. And as I processed all of this, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, the knowledge that I could navigate this landscape with both compassion and authority, that I could decide whether to allow entry into my life based on integrity and respect, and that no amount of regret or longing could override the autonomy I had fought so hard to establish. And in that empowerment, I also recognized the enduring presence of the child I had once been, not as a source of weakness, but as a guide, a reminder of the resilience, empathy, and determination that had carried me through years of loneliness, uncertainty, and adversity. And it was that awareness that allowed me to approach the situation with balance, clarity, and purpose, fully aware that I could engage, withdraw, or observe without compromising my peace, my independence, or the life I had painstakingly built. And as the days passed and interactions with them continued, I maintained a deliberate, measured approach, engaging when I saw sincerity, setting boundaries when necessary, acknowledging the past without allowing it to destabilize the present, and carefully evaluating the authenticity of every word and action, because I knew that genuine recognition of the consequences of abandonment could not be rushed, that accountability required time, consistency, and reflection, and that any meaningful reconnection would have to be built on these principles, not on the fragile hope of words alone. And as I processed all of this, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, the knowledge that I could navigate this landscape with both compassion and authority, that I could decide whether to allow entry into my life based on integrity and respect, and that no amount of regret or longing could override the autonomy I had fought so hard to establish. And in that empowerment, I also recognized the enduring presence of the child I had once been, not as a source of weakness, but as a guide, a reminder of the resilience, empathy, and determination that had carried me through years of loneliness, uncertainty, and adversity. And it was that awareness that allowed me to approach the situation with balance, clarity, and purpose, fully aware that I could engage, withdraw, or observe without compromising my peace, my independence, or the life I had painstakingly built. And as the days passed and interactions with them continued, I maintained a deliberate, measured approach, engaging when I saw sincerity, setting boundaries when necessary, acknowledging the past without allowing it to destabilize the present, and carefully evaluating the authenticity of every word and action, because I knew that genuine recognition of the consequences of abandonment could not be rushed, that accountability required time, consistency, and reflection, and that any meaningful reconnection would have to be built on these principles, not on the fragile hope of words alone. And as I processed all of this, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, the knowledge that I could navigate this landscape with both compassion and authority, that I could decide whether to allow entry into my life based on integrity and respect, and that no amount of regret or longing could override the autonomy I had fought so hard to establish. And in that empowerment, I also recognized the enduring presence of the child I had once been, not as a source of weakness, but as a guide, a reminder of the resilience, empathy, and determination that had carried me through years of loneliness, uncertainty, and adversity. And it was that awareness that allowed me to approach the situation with balance, clarity, and purpose, fully aware that I could engage, withdraw, or observe without compromising my peace, my independence, or the life I had painstakingly built. And as the days passed and interactions with them continued, I maintained a deliberate, measured approach, engaging when I saw sincerity, setting boundaries when necessary, acknowledging the past without allowing it to destabilize the present, and carefully evaluating the authenticity of every word and action, because I knew that genuine recognition of the consequences of abandonment could not be rushed, that accountability required time, consistency, and reflection, and that any meaningful reconnection would have to be built on these principles, not on the fragile hope of words alone. And as I processed all of this, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, the knowledge that I could navigate this landscape with both compassion and authority, that I could decide whether to allow entry into my life based on integrity and respect, and that no amount of regret or longing could override the autonomy I had fought so hard to establish. And in that empowerment, I also recognized the enduring presence of the child I had once been, not as a source of weakness, but as a guide, a reminder of the resilience, empathy,